All right, Dr. Know-It-All. Let me tell you about this dream I had.
Sure.
It's this really skinny kid from high school. He's like leaning up against a building.
Right.
And all these big kids from high school are going over to him. And I think they're going to beat him up. But it turns out they just want diet tips. Can't you figure this out, healer?
Well,
Thank you, Pawsey. Sir Pause a
no,
lot.
I see. I think
Dr. No Energy.
One of my favorite cult classic shows is Dr. Katz, an animated show that ran for 6 seasons on Comedy Central starting in 1995. It had extremely sparse visuals and forgoed a script in favor of ad-libbing around general notes. But it had such a strong premise that, at least to me, it didn't matter. Dr. Katz, professional therapist, would usually treat 2 stand-up comedians per episode, who would essentially just do slightly modified jokes from their sets. What made the show work for me is how natural it felt. With only a few exceptions, Katz never needed to prod much or give too specific a setup to make the jokes feel like the kind of personal stories you'd actually bring up to a therapist.
so. You were married once, is that right? We don't
Yes.
talk about it much, but
We
you
don't talk about it a lot. No, we
Yeah.
don't.
obviously didn't pan out.
No, it didn't. It didn't take. Well, there were problems. He tricked me into getting married.
How so?
He told me I was pregnant.
These jokes feel just at home on a squiggly couch for the world's gentlest dad as they do front and center on a stage for a large audience. It's that intimacy, that authenticity, I think, that gives stand-up comedy its ethos. Not every comic pours their soul out on stage, but most comics feel like real people you know just a little bit better after the show is over. There's a reason people felt so betrayed to learn that John Mulaney's lovable persona on stage was so far removed from the struggles he went through in real life, or why Louis C.K.'s outing as a sex creep makes a lot of his previous material hit a sour note even more than it already did, or why Dave Chappelle's defenders will often say that his material can't be transphobic because he's not transphobic. It's an inherent contradiction of stand-up that a performer must be an authentic version of themselves while exaggerating and performing what we all know to be something not taken seriously. The stand-up comedian must tell the truth with lies. They must be saying something true about the world or tap into the genuine person on stage, ideally both, all the while relying on absurdity to get the job done. This is different from other forms of comedy, especially those that rely more on visuals. The slapstick of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Jerry Lewis, and even Lucille Ball found their laughs in how they pulled their audience away from reality into the fantastical. They defied physics and reason and the physical limitations of the human body. Jerry Lewis once said that the premise of all comedy is a man in trouble, and the reason cartoonish antics have been a part of the comedy landscape for as long as comedy has been around is not only because you can get into more trouble when you bend the rules of reality, but more importantly, the man in trouble can make it out okay. Slapstick without exaggeration is horror. The sound effects added to the Three Stooges are as much of an actor as any of the men on screen. Stand-up takes a different approach. Though stand-up has its roots in minstrel shows, vaudeville, radio shows, and motion pictures, it stands as the art form it is today because it isn't those things. By that I mean those are performances, and we know they're performances. We know those are actors and props and the product of a script that was written in advance and rehearsed until it stopped sounding like what it was to become what it needed to be. And yes, stand-up as a craft is also all of those things, but for stand-up to work, we feel like it isn't. It's not the suspension of disbelief that lets us connect with comedians on stage, it's just belief. There are several aspects of stand-up that not only lend themselves to perceived authenticity, but demand it in turn. The first is the format itself, the lone person on a stage telling jokes to an audience. If you add something more to that, it very quickly becomes something other than stand-up comedy. Whether we're talking props, puppets, or pianos, as soon as it's something other than one person, one mic on one stage, it's not stand-up comedy anymore. Bo Burnham, one of my favorite comedians of all time, doesn't really do stand-up. He did, hopefully will do, one-man shows with lots of music. It's theater. And while there's certainly moments of authenticity and vulnerability, they're juxtaposed against bright lights and some absolute bops. Jeff Dunham, one of my favorite comedians as a kid, is a ventriloquist. Take Jeff Dunham off a stage and put him in a high school talent show, and that's a guy with puppets. You put Maria Bamford in her living room telling jokes to her parents, and that's still stand-up. Gallagher smashed things on stage. Woo! None of this is to disparage comedians who do things other than talk on stage. They're still comedians, and they're not doing a tainted version of stand-up that I'm trying to keep pure. But when you introduce musical numbers, or other characters, or external recordings for the comedian to play off of and interact with, it's no longer stand-up. When people disparage comics who use gimmicks like that, the core of that criticism comes from the perception that those comedians are trying to benefit from that historic legacy of authenticity, while simultaneously dragging it down with theatrics that risk making it just another show. Additionally, the tone of delivery in stand-up is as direct as any face-to-face talk. A stand-up speaks in the first person to an audience they address in the second person. Even though the comic is often up on a stage, brightly lit as the person in charge of the show, the style of speech pulls discourse into the here and now, and it's in that context that comics share the specific vulnerability that comes with trying to be clever. They may be the one with the microphone, but it's us they're trying to impress. Speaking of, the second aspect of stand-up giving it authenticity seems so obvious as to be trivial, but it's just as important now as it was 100 years ago. The microphone. Specifically, the stage microphone. Starting in the mid to late 1920s, the entertainment industry was becoming increasingly wired for sound, and that radically changed how comics performed. They could be loud while speaking soft. The volume, pitch range, and vocal production of the comic became closer to that of conversational speech, and the presentation of text became more like that of conversational American English in pronunciation and phrasing. Let's use a visual metaphor. Stage acting is way different than screen acting, not because one takes more skill, but because they have vastly different purposes. A camera can get up close on an actor to see every minor shift in expression their 40-plus facial muscles can create. A stage actor has to emote for the cheap seats. And hey, that's part of the fun, but real people don't gesticulate like they're walking through a cave filled with spiders to show emotions, unless they're theater kids. The projection one needs to fill a theater is great for establishing one's authority and presence, but that's not how people talk. I'm not sure if our internet-addled minds can comprehend how brain-bending it was at the time to go to a performance in 1927 and hear a performer speaking in the same tone of voice as everyone else. It's part of what made Will Rogers a folk hero. He came to prominence just as the technology was catching up, so he was able to deliver his take on the news of the day in an aw-shucks gum-chewing style that made him way more relatable than the vaudeville theatrics that entertainers had to use just a few years previously to fill a sizable venue.
Here we are in a country with more wheat and more corn, and more money in the bank, and more cotton, more everything in the world. There's not a product that you can name that we haven't got more of it than any country ever had in the face of the earth, and yet we've got people starving. Now, if they ain't something cockeyed in an arrangement like that, then this microphone here in front of me is, well, it's a cuspidor, that's all.
Thanks to the microphone and the PA systems it connected to, performers could talk how people talk, and the audience could actually hear them. The third aspect reinforcing the authenticity of stand-up has less to do with the art and venues themselves than it does with the environments surrounding them. Stand-up specials can sit alongside sitcoms, movies, and animation forms of comedy because they offer something different. They're where you go to see someone more real. There were elements of this dating back to Mark Twain and especially Will Rogers, but it was the 60s and 70s where the shift from transposable vaudeville jokes to a comic's personal stream of thought became expected as central to the medium. The counterculture movement of the 1960s saw a sharp rise in nihilistic cynicism directed at the father-knows-best depictions of what was considered to be the ideal American family of most sitcoms. And as the Vietnam War raged on and scandals like Watergate were further eroding faith and trust in American institutions, the public wanted something from their entertainment that they felt they weren't getting from their politicians. They wanted to be told the truth. They wanted someone on stage to speak to them like human beings. No medium did or does this better than stand-up comedy. The irreverent aura of stand-up paradoxically makes it feel safer to tell the truth. The societal norms that govern civility have been temporarily set aside and, for better or worse, comedy can see what lay behind them. Finally, there's the nature of the content itself. You can't explain a joke into being funny, and I can say with some experience that people tend not to like it when you try. Comedy requires the listener to not only get the joke, but find the humor on their own. It's the listener, not the comedian, that decides what is and is not funny. A ton of fresh stand-ups bomb their first set by telling jokes they themselves find hilarious, or the ones that kill in their friend group, without realizing that without a connection to the audience, they are not funny. According to benign violation theory, something is funny when it violates a norm, but at the same time is recognized to be benign. This means a joke has to be grounded in some sort of norm, social, political, moral, linguistic, etc., and the violation of that norm has to be within the wildly varied parameters of acceptability. All of this has to be intuited as much as possible by the audience rather than being explained to them. Too much setup informing them of everything they need to know in order to share the norm needed for the joke to work, and the comedian will lose that connection and relatability with their audience. Here's a joke we could break down in this way. Cancel culture's on everyone's mind these days. Yeah, Lens Crafters just dropped Dan Crenshaw as a spokesperson. I thought it was because of something he might have said, but no, it turns out everyone just thought they were going to get their glasses half off. So what do you need to know about the premise of this joke in order for it to work? Well, you need to know that Lens Crafters is a company that makes eyeglasses. You also need to know not only who Dan Crenshaw is, but that he's missing an eye. It's also good if you know what cancel culture is, the notion that people lose positions for controversial things they say, because that sets up an expectation for why he was dropped that can then be subverted. If an audience doesn't know one or any of these things, for example, I have a friend who doesn't wear glasses who didn't know what Lens Crafters was, you're not going to get the joke. If a comedian tries to set up the joke with that information, Lens Crafters, the eyeglasses company, just dropped Dan Crenshaw, the Texas representative with one eye, as a spokesperson. It not only ruins the timing, but laying out the relevant information needed for a joke like that makes it crystal clear where the joke is heading, setting up an expectation that then can't be violated. But there's also a problem if the audience knows too much about the premise. Dan Crenshaw was never a spokesperson for Lens Crafters. If someone is very familiar with the representative, they might know that, and it might make them unable to get on board with the premise of the joke even if they hate the guy. They don't share the norm you're violating, which in this case is a factual norm. You might think that they could just will themselves into the suspension of disbelief that would let them enjoy a comedy show, but since laughter is intuitive more than it is logical, that might not really be possible. Hence the necessity of drink minimums. There's also, of course, the moral norms of making fun of someone for having a disability or for being a wounded veteran. And while some people might be far enough removed to find humor in topics they take seriously outside of a comedy show, it's just going to hit too close to home for others. Comedians often rely just as much on ignorance as they do on knowledge when setting up the premise of a joke. Comedy at the expense of marginalized people often showcases this problem. A majority group might have the knowledge of stereotypes the comedian will rely on for the premise, while members of that marginalized group can't connect with those stereotypes on a purely factual basis. See Chappelle's framing of the infamous J.K. Rowling letter in his latest special. If you actually know what it said, you'd know his description of it is incorrect, so the premise falls flat. There has to be a connection between comedian and audience in order for humor to work. It's why comedy doesn't age or travel well. The more a comedian can relate to an audience, the more they can see into their head, the more intimate that connection becomes, the stronger those norms will be, and the more trust the audience will have when the comedian violates them. Yeah, that was all about the setup. We haven't even talked about how to bring an audience to a good punchline. Gotta save that for the last video in the trilogy. But there's one more thing that can build a sense of intimacy and camaraderie between stand-up and the audience, one that didn't fit neatly into any of the reasons I gave above. So, let's get into part fuck you, piss, shit, and cum. Hey, do you remember a few years ago when a ton of articles came out about a study that said that people who swear a lot are more honest? Well, as a general rule, anytime a study makes the rounds like that, you should treat it like pop science, in that it gets way less interesting the more you understand it. Those headlines were based on a 2017 study with the admittedly eye-catching title of Frankly, We Do Give a Damn, the relationship between profanity and honesty, which found a consistent positive relationship between profanity and honesty and a negative association between profanity and deception. Publications and their readers love studies like this because it offers an excuse for a vice they may have. Who wouldn't love to hear about a study that found double whoppers were associated with decreased blood pressure, in addition to making a kind of intuitive sense. If someone doesn't filter themselves regarding profanity, they must not filter themselves when dishing out the truth. This is true to an extent. The prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia of the brain have been shown to play a role in managing our swearing etiquette, and is responsible for evaluating the current social context. However, a response to that study published the next year titled Honest People Tend to Use Less, Not More Profanity, used different measuring tools and claimed that the previous study made false assumptions regarding the scales they were using. There are multiple different ways to measure honesty and countless social contexts that would read swearing differently, so maybe there's not a one-to-one inference to be drawn between swearing and anything else. That doesn't mean profanity doesn't have a significant impact on language. Swearing is defined as language use in which the expression 1 refers to something taboo or stigmatized in the swearer's culture, 2 is not intended to be interpreted literally, and 3 can be used to express strong emotions or attitudes. The combination of these aspects lend a lot of expressive power to profanity, and as a result can be more or less functional in particular circumstances. In other words, context is everything, especially in stand-up comedy. On one hand, profanity heightens the intensity and emotion of speech. There's a reason that sexual intimidation, discrimination, and verbal abuse are all often accompanied with swear words. On the other hand, swearing in more informal or in-group settings can bring up feelings of connection and trust. When used in a setting like stand-up comedy, the use of swear words can signal that certain usual taboos are momentarily inapplicable. In that way, it's possible to achieve an elevated sense of hilarity in public, as the use of swear words implies that it's permitted to lose control and gain a sense of letting go. This was explored pretty thoroughly in a paper by Susan Sizer titled On the Uses of Obscenity in Live Stand-Up Comedy, which closely followed two professional road comics playing the comedy club circuit across the US. Specifically, she looked at how profanity was used to heighten the experience rather than drag it down, embracing language in all its potency rather than simply talking about piss, shit, and cum. Comedy crowds expect to be surprised and thrown into laughter by a comic's act, and sometimes dirty words play a large part in orienting audiences to the kind of playful relationship that constitutes live stand-up comedy. According to Sizer, obscenity contributes to the sense of informality and intimacy in a stand-up set in several ways. The majority of obscene words come from basic human needs and feelings, and are born and reborn in that realm of intimacy. Across the world and through time, the most common swear words involve bodily functions, body parts, and sex, various flavors and ruminations on piss, shit, cum, and the things from which they flow. It's a strange universal code of language where the parts and processes we all have and do are taboo if they're gross or intimate. A skillful comic can simultaneously signal a playful, informal atmosphere, establish vulnerability by talking about their most embarrassing functions, and push the line of acceptable boundaries further, all with a well-crafted dick joke. Can is the operative word there. You can use profanity effectively. So let's compare and contrast two comedians known for their obscene and controversial performances. Andrew Dice Clay is a shit comedian, in every sense of the word. His routines are about shit, and they are shit. Here's a typical Andrew Dice Clay joke.
Oh, and then you'll get him in bed, you'll hear stuff like,
Oh, why is it you always have to make love to me from behind? Don't you like to look at my face when you make love to me?
I don't know, your face, your ass, what's the difference? Get it done!
The punchline is to be gross. Shock humor works when it hits you out of nowhere, and the absurdity of how far over the line you found yourself adds a sort of meta-humor to the situation. The logic of the joke still needs to make sense, but it's the simultaneous question of, how the fuck did we get here, answered with, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense, that actually provides the humor. Clay doesn't do that. He starts gross and tries to get grosser, and every joke resets the gross meter so that every setup has you thinking, okay, how's he gonna make this one about shit, piss, and cum? And it's always the first way you think of. Instead of introducing profanity into a set to remind you of how you and your friends talk, you get the impression of a deeply unclever creep trying to be the coolest guy at a party. Also, it's a high school party, and he's like 35 and no one knows who told him about it. On the other end of things, Lenny Bruce used profanity to highlight the hypocrisies and contradictions of society while speaking how normal people spoke when no one they couldn't trust was around. As he put it, let me tell you the truth. The truth is what is, and what should be is a fantasy. He believed so much in this sensibility of truth-telling at any cost that he went to jail for it time after time right up until he died, either from a drug overdose or persecution, depending on your point of view. In his autobiography, he recounts his first trial for obscenity in San Francisco. He said cocksucker on stage in 1961. The officer who arrested him said that it was a homosexual act, which Bruce found strange because he'd very much appreciate the act coming from any woman that he'd like to know, love, or marry. When he was sworn in at the courthouse, the arresting officer had to explain that he'd said cocksucker. The judge confirmed that he'd said cocksucker. The district attorney couldn't believe that he'd said cocksucker. All these men who were helping to put him on trial for saying cocksucker on stage seemed to really like having an excuse to say cocksucker. The official transcript of that trial shows the court testimony of jazz critic Ralph Gleason, a witness in Bruce's defense, saying the following. The theme of the performance on the night in question was a social criticism of stereotypes and of the hypocrisy of contemporary society. He attempted to demonstrate to the audience a proposition that's familiar to students of semantics, which is that words have been given in our society almost a magical meaning that has no relation to the facts. And I think that he tried in the course of this show that evening to demonstrate that there is no harm inherent in words themselves. Andrew Dice Clay, on the other hand, talks about piss, shit, and cum. See the difference? When we talk about jokes and stand-up, what we often remember is the punchline for probably obvious reasons. But the setups, the premises of a joke are more important. Without them, there's nothing to subvert, no established norms to violate, no chance of getting the joke. Relating to your audience is possibly the most important rule in stand-up comedy, because it's the medium that does it the best. The third and last video in this series is about what to do next and what separates the Lenny Bruces from the Andrew Dice Clays of the world. The art of stepping into the darkest depths of the human experience and bringing the audience with you to the other side.